Bitcoin is poised for a massive break. The technicals are signaling for a massive pump in price.
Meanwhile, the fundamentals are sounding the alarms for an interesting insight into what the Bitcoin consensus may be.
It either becomes a life raft for tons of money, or it just becomes a skeptical object that people do not adopt entirely. In this video, I'll be going over the technicals that are showing us we are ready for a surge in price, and I will also be highlighting the potential boom or doom that Bitcoin may endure due to reckless government spending and the largest debt spiral that we have ever seen,
which will have huge ramifications on the US dollar as we know it.
My name is Matt Jimenez, and if you don't know who I am an entrepreneur who has worked with the greatest minds in finance. One thing that I've learned through experience is that cash flow is king. Now, I make these videos to shine light on something I like to call
smart risk.
Because every decision we make, whether we do or don't do something, still has its own risk attached to that very thing. Now, without further ado,
let's jump right into it.
Before we get into Bitcoin's price action, I'd like to go over something called a debt spiral. Now, for those of you that don't understand what a debt spiral is, to put simply, it is when somebody takes out more debt in order to cover old debt.
Now, the problem with this is oftentimes the new debt that you take out is attached to a much higher interest rate,
which entails a debt spiral, because you could see very quickly how the old debt will never fully get paid because it keeps getting compounded with a new debt with a higher and higher interest rate, which makes payments almost impossible to get caught up with. This is the very exact thing that is happening with the US government at this current moment. Let's start off with the national debt that is currently growing every single day. The problem with this amount of debt is in 2024, $16 trillion, nearly half of that debt is going to mature. Now, when debt matures, that means it is owed, meaning you have to pay it. Kind of like your Amex card. When you swipe your credit card and that credit matures, you must pay your payment, or what happens? It goes to collections. The problem of this is majority of the debt was borrowed over the last decade when interest rates were much lower than where they are right now. Now, there's only two ways for the government to try and attempt to pay the matured debt back. One is taxation, and we all know that taxation does not even account to a remotely close number to 16 trillion. So what their alternative is borrowing. They are going to have to ask the Federal Reserve for X amount of dollars to pay back this debt of 16 trillion in 2024. But the problem is when we do borrow from the Federal Reserve to pay this back, interest rates have risen dramatically since we borrowed all this previous currency. So now we're taking out new currency with a much higher interest rate, only making our debt almost impossible to get caught up on. By the end of the year, the government will owe about 1.2 trillion just in interest payments. Now, I didn't just make up this 1.2 trillion. Let me explain how I got this number. Because interest rates across the board right now, whether it's short-term or long-term, short-term is sitting at about 5.5% and long-term is sitting at about 5.1%. Now let's do the math. If we take $16 trillion and multiply it by 5%, that puts the interest portion at half the national debt at $800 billion. Now, there's still a remaining 17 trillion left for the other half of the national debt. Now, if we take the other $17 trillion and leave it at, let's say, 3%, that gives us about $500 billion in debt. Add those two together and you get just about
$1.2 trillion in debt. And that is just interest.
And we will end up there by the end of 2024. Now you can see how taking on new debt to pay off the old debt will just leave you in a slush of debt that you cannot afford because the interest rates on the new debt is much higher than the old interest rate on the old debt.
Because majority of the currency borrowed was at a much lower interest rate
than what is being lent out today, considering interest rates have risen. Now you're probably wondering, why does this matter? Well, it comes down to, like I stated earlier, how are we going to pay it? I told you taxation is not going to be enough, so we are defaulting to definitely needing to rely on printing more money for us to then borrow, which will lead to hyperinflation and devaluing our currency. Now, we all know what happens when you devalue currency and inflation runs rampant. Everything gets expensive. Not because the valuable is getting more valuable, but because your dollar is getting much weaker. Because when you increase money supply, the value of that money continuously gets devalued, which can often reflect in asset prices. And for this video, I'm talking about Bitcoin. Okay, so now that we understand roughly what's going on with our money supply going into 2024, with debt becoming much more of a burden to try and pay off, and the potential increase in money supply. Before we get into the charts, I'd like to get into the technical pattern that I see forming on Bitcoin that is definitely poising us for a breakout to the upside. This pattern is called an ascending wedge. An ascending wedge is formed when you have a resistance level meeting a trend line. So oftentimes it looks like a half triangle bent on its side, kind of like an acute angle. But really what this represents is showing the strength of buyers and the weakness of sellers, because you have a series of higher lows and you have sellers failing to make lower highs, meaning you have all this upward pressure bouncing on a ceiling. And what happens is you have a breakout to the upside because sellers cannot push price down because the buying pressure is so strong. And that's currently what's happening in Bitcoin's chart. And you could pull any other assets up and look at their charts that have ascending wedges, and time after time, it is the same exact thing, because all price action is a demonstration of what's happening between buyers and sellers. So let's jump to it. Here you can see the wedge that I have drawn out. It is on the weekly time frame. So each candle represents an entire week of trading. Where we close this week, I'm not sure, but I know we are in this ascending wedge for sure. Most of the times in an ascending wedge, as you can see, price comes to a squeeze, what I like to call the pinch. Each low is higher than the next, but yet the sellers cannot push the highs lower, which will often form this ascending wedge, which is, like I said, tons of buying pressure meeting weakness in selling. Now, my speculation is that we come a little bit further in this pinch and form a break to the upside. My speculation is that Bitcoin will pop up to the $37,000 area before experiencing a pullback. I believe the pullback will dip us down back to the top of this ascending wedge, and that wedge may act as a form of support because price is coming from above rather than below. So this is the technicals that you could see show Bitcoin ready for a surge in price. Another interesting thing is if we pop over to the monthly chart of Bitcoin and we grab our Fibonacci retracement from the previous high down to our most recent swing low, we are now approaching the 32% retracement, which also aligns with the thesis of that $37,000 Bitcoin, maybe $2,000 a little shy, which is at 35,000, which, like I said, that is most likely the area where we're headed, where we may experience a little bit of selling action to dip us back down and test the top of that wedge, which I'm hoping will act as support. Okay, so now that we see the technicals forming on Bitcoin, one thing I always like to do, and something that I've done over the last almost decade of analyzing financial charts, is I love tracking the dollar. The reason I love tracking the dollar is because everything is denominated in dollars. So when we are tracking Bitcoin, we're also tracking dollar strength indirectly. Oftentimes, if we track the dollar and we could see whether we are headed for a weak month or a strong month, oftentimes we can easily predict on the flip side of that coin that Bitcoin may experience a strong month or a weak month, because it's always the opposite. Saying Bitcoin is going to surge in price is also saying the dollar is going to plummet in price, because what do you use to buy Bitcoin? Dollars. So if the dollar is weaker, it's going to take more dollars to buy that very same Bitcoin. Not because Bitcoin is more valuable because it's the same protocol, but because the dollar is weaker and we need more of them to acquire the same amount of Bitcoin. So now let's jump into the Dixie. Looking at the DXY, which is the dollar index, if we look on the 4-hour time frame, we have a clear break of the trend line. And at the top of that break of the trend line, that is also the formation of a right shoulder. A head and shoulder pattern is often a reversal signal, whether it's from a downtrend or an uptrend. In this case, it's a clear uptrend, and we are definitely looking like we are having a significant pullback in dollar strength or some type of stagnation in the dollar. One thing that I'm doing to prepare for any case, whether Bitcoin surges in price or plummets in price, like I said, cash flow is king. So one thing that I prioritize is generating income. One thing that's been a massive help for me is utilizing the power of software to help me increase my cash flow. Now, this is my very own experience, and this is not financial advice by any means. I'm just letting you know what I'm doing. So instead of holding an asset long term and dealing with its fluctuations, I decided to mainly focus on the movements, whether that be a long position or a short position. I'm not even participating in that. I'm letting the software do it all for me. And my biggest play is using the monthly percentages in profits to reinvest into other things that I like to speculate on. But the most important thing is that in a time like this, you're able to find a way to generate some type of income, whether that be your job, a business, or a unique investment vehicle. If you're interested in the one that I'm using, the link is down below. And if you got any value from this video, please leave a like, comment, and/or subscribe. And I'll see you on the next one.